of endemic chronic challenges. And I'm just, when we have a flash moment like this, what flashes through your mind?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that Bridge has already referenced is, the extraordinary goodness of the human spirit. I mean, it sounds trite, but most of us, the vast, vast majority of us, want to help one another. And crisis brings it out, but it's there. It's always there. It's waiting. It's always under the surface. Yes, we have our families to provide for, our jobs to do, our own selves to take care of. But people say, well, what do we have in common in this country? In this age of division. And I would just say, like if I go through the Special Olympics communities around the country and around the world, I dare say, there are people who are Republicans and Democrats. There are people who are rich and poor, people who are firefighters and CEOs and law enforcement officers and teachers and moms and dads and you name it. They give. They want to be on the field. They want to be helping. They want to make a difference. It's soul work. Service is soul work. And this is a country where both at the individual level and at the collective level, we have almost in our DNA the desire, the willingness. And this is very distinctive. Even the idea of volunteerism is not familiar in many, many countries around the world. People are, what does that mean you don't get paid? What does that mean you do this as a citizen? I mean, this is a uniquely, in some ways, American gift to the world. The idea that citizens from their soul, from their heart, from the volunteer space, that we want to give. We want to be asked. We want to answer the call. We want to help. We've seen this in spades. Bridge is right. Our politics, our broader culture right now is not in a healthy place. I like to think we have two we have two epidemics. One is an epidemic of disease. The other is an epidemic of division. And we're seeing both on display. The good news is the answer to both is the same, and that is to unite behind common purpose. We can beat the disease if we have common purpose. We can beat division with common purpose. So while it feels overwhelming at times to look at the cacophony of voices and to say, am I going to listen to this governor or that governor or this scientist or that doctor or this person in the White House or this person on Capitol Hill, I would plead with our elected officials to join together in common purpose. Whatever and I think the governors want to do. I mean, my read is, I don't know any of these men or women personally, really, but my guess is the governors would love to have a common voice, even if there may be distinctions that can be marshaled within various communities around the country about how to respond. But in common voice, with the science leading the way, imagine how much calm we would all feel if we could say, oh, that's the common message. Now I can buy into it. Mm-hmm. Imagine if there were a common call, not just to pass the legislation that so many of us don't understand, just to get money out. That's the number one priority for sure. But what if we were beginning the conversation about common purpose and putting people back to work the way President Roosevelt did in the midst of the Great Depression? What if we were hiring 500,000 or 1 million or 2 or 3 million people to join something like the Civilian Conservation Corps? Bridge has been brainstorming around this. Why not a corps for today, so that we're not just helping people to stem the bleeding, but helping people rebuild hope and purpose in common service to the country and to one another? I think there are so many ways in which the call to service is both intimately American, intimately meaningful to people, and purposeful right now if we can marshal the will. And I think that's what people like Bridge and, again, you say you started out at the beginning saying there's a Republican and a Democrat. I guess so. I guess, yes, we do come from different parties, but it's just a good reminder that that's just one identity I might carry. Mm-hmm. Many other things in addition to being a Democrat. Right. And first and foremost, at least in moments like this, I'm an American. And as an American, I want to help my community. I want to help my street, my neighbors. I want to help those people who are part of my life. And I don't think there's an inch of distance between me and 99% of the rest of Americans on that score.
That's great. Well, thanks to you both for your service, including with one another. Let me encourage the audience to please send in your questions. I'll start a little bit with Tim and John, but as we've done in in all of these webinars, we try to field as many questions from the audience as possible, often bringing 2 or 3 questions together if they're similar. Let me start with something that you touched on, Tim, including pointing to John in this, which is the idea of national service. You both pointed to a number of different examples of people serving very locally in their own community. Volunteerism goes right back to our founding in the earliest periods. Alexis de Tocqueville talks about it in the early 1800s. But the idea of national service, including during the New Deal, when the Civilian Conservation Corps and other activities pulled people forward into ideas and areas where they were giving back. Could you explain that concept a little bit? How do you think about it, and how formalized does it need to be? What is national service?
Sure, maybe I'll jump in. First, I want to say, just to amplify what Tim said about service being in the American DNA. You know, Virginia's founder, Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote that mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness, wasn't just talking about, you know, more cars or a home or a decent way of living or raising a family. He was also talking about a cooperative enterprise, the public happiness that we help one another achieve, and that if someone's homeless or your neighbor's struggling, your happiness is inextricably linked to their happiness. But I think it's interesting, you mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps. In 1929, we had 3% unemployment. By 1933, we had 25% unemployment. In January 2020, we had 3% unemployment. And today we already have 26 million Americans out of work, with the Federal Reserve of St. Louis saying we may reach 32% unemployment, which is 7 percentage points higher than the height of the Great Depression. So Franklin Roosevelt calls Congress in emergency session in 1933. By summer, he's got 250,000 young unemployed men working in the woods on our public and agricultural lands. And over the life of the program, 3 million of them. And they were paid a living stipend. They provided support to their families. They, you know, were no longer festering in the streets. And what's remarkable about it, over that period, 3 billion trees were planted. Think of the carbon sink impact of that act alone. 800 state parks were created. 84 million acres of public land was protected from soil erosion, which is equivalent to the acreage of our national park system today. So it was an extraordinary public effort to put people to work and conserve our resources. So we're actually, Tim and I are working on a number of efforts, as we like to do. And one of them is we're proposing to basically borrow the playbook from the Civilian Conservation Corps, but not just make it a big government program like they did in 1933, but to use federal investment to have at least 250,000 young people in a national service program called AmeriCorps, where you get a living stipend. And after you finish your full year of service in groups like Habitat for Humanity or City Year Teach for America, you get an education award to defray the cost of college. It's almost like a version of the GI Bill, but also to grow and provide service year fellowships. You know, we need a contact tracing corps. We only have 2,200 contact tracers today. We need 300,000. National service could do that. We need a ramped up medical reserve corps, or doctors and nurses and others who could help bring surge capacity in communities across the United States. National service could do that. And finally, our crisis has brought to mind our educational inequities. Most of the country, most of the students are in high schools with grad rates above 90%. But a subset of students are still in low performing schools where grad rates are only 40%, and they need tutors and mentors, and national service could do that too.
I think it's amazing the way Bridge can recite all those statistics. I just, when I listen to him, I'm like, wow, I'm ready to go back to class with Professor Bridgeland. But I think the question is a big one, Bill. Like, what does it mean to do something nationally? Americans will do things locally, and a huge amount of the work gets done locally, but equality can't be created locally. We have to do that together. The kinds of things Bridge described, there's some things that we can all do locally in our faith-based institutions, in our civic organizations, in our places of business, Businesses can commit to larger amounts of volunteer commitment. Many do. Faith-based institutions can commit to relief and support work for those on the margins and those living on the brink, and they do. But we can't solve big problems one at a time. And this is a big problem. The division itself is a big problem. And service and the kind of work and the kind of ideas Bridge just shared are ways to bring us back together in common purpose that we can agree on. There really are almost no disagreements on many of these things. And in some ways, the whole division industrial complex, I dare say, has to be disintermediated. We need inclusion or a unified industrial complex that allows us to get back together so we can solve problems around equality. I mean, Jefferson's words, I agree with Bridge, are change the course of history. But there were blind spots, needless to say, in Jefferson's experience. And there were blind spots in what he saw. We have blind spots today, just as Jefferson did. Some of them are the same, shockingly. We still have blind spots around issues of race. We still have blind spots around income inequality. We still have blind spots around the treatment of our environment. We still have blind spots around the recognition of service for people in uniform. And there are so many ways in which this division has stopped us from solving the big problems that our particularly young people are so eager to solve, and particularly elderly people have so many ideas about how we can solve. So we have a wisdom generation that can teach. We have a younger generation that can work, put them together, give them common purpose, and we can begin not just to rebuild the institutions or the services we want, but our belief in ourselves, which in some ways I think is much more critical.
I'd love to drill down into the mechanics of this just a little bit, since you both have, on the one hand, terrific with the big idea, but you've also actually managed these programs on the ground. John, the kind of bootstrapping that you're talking about building a service structure to just go out and deal with testing and tracing and all of those things. Let me start first with the ones that we have. You mentioned AmeriCorps. Amy Singer has written saying that when the COVID outbreak happened, AmeriCorps programs had to suspend some of their programs initially. So just starting with the one that we have, what are you hearing about what it means to get that up and running? And then maybe we can talk about how to take that or things like Special Olympics or other groups that currently exist to serve the kind of bigger program that we might need now in the current crisis. But let's talk about the one we have. What are you hearing about how that's working operationally in the crisis and what they need to get moving again?
Yeah, that's good. I just want to build on quickly what Tim said. The big idea of actually imagine in this country, in a country that doesn't ask very much of us, pay taxes, maybe we serve on juries, but we have a lot of freedom and a lot of opportunity. Have to do much more in economic inequality, et cetera. But imagine it, 18-year-olds to 28-year-olds had a formal rite of passage where they had an opportunity to serve, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Black, white, brown, any faith, any income background, different geographies in common purpose. And Amy's question is a wonderful one, both the AmeriCorps and the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps brought Peace Corps volunteers back to the United States, suspended activities, abundance of caution. Obviously health comes first and the wellness of the volunteers. But to Amy's point, what's so exciting right now is, let me just take you, I'm on the board of City Year. And right now the City Year Corps members are tutoring and mentoring students in low performing schools all across the country virtually. They're participating in meetings with teachers about the early warning indicators of students whose attendance patterns, even virtually, their behavior, course performance in reading and math and other courses signal that they're not on track to graduate from high school and persist. And so there are many things that national service members can do now through AmeriCorps, which is a one-year program. You get a living stipend, an education award equivalent to about a Pell Grant to defray the cost of college after you finish your service. And you can work in any one of a number of areas that are highly relevant. I think AmeriCorps needs to create a contact tracing corps right now. And encouragingly, there's a bill in the Senate, Senator Coons and others have introduced legislation to do exactly that. So Amy's right. We have to pivot from, emergency cessation of operations to how do we think creatively about using our new environment and new tools to put these extraordinary young people to work for the country in a time of great need.
Got it. So the idea would be some of these volunteers or AmeriCorps participants, committed citizens, would actually be part of the teams that would go out and test people and teach people how to trace. Who manages that? Do we just sort of put AmeriCorps on steroids as the operating agent, or do you see this as a federal government program, or how does it work?
Yeah, what's so powerful and kind of little known about the Corporation for National Community Service, all these Corps members serve through more than 1,000 nonprofits. These are local community and faith-based organizations. And that's why, in part, both Republicans who support big citizenship and Democrats who like, strong public investment, they've been able to come together on this new model. We didn't have that in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was all a federal government program. A young General George C. Marshall in the US Army organized it, which was superb. But the good news is, because of AmeriCorps and VISTA and these conservation corps, we have all these nonprofits and voluntary associations to Tocqueville who came to America to study America's prisons, and was just completely blown away by what Tim talked about, that service is uniquely in the American DNA, that we can run it through nonprofit organizations, including very sophisticated health nonprofits who will make sure that the AmeriCorps volunteers are safe. A lot of the volunteering initially will be virtual, and to the extent they are eventually deployed, it will be more than consistent with the NIH guidelines and CDC guidelines to safely engage in that service.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Bridge is making a great point on this big citizenship versus big public purpose. And, in the Special Olympics community, and I encourage people to continue to go to Special Olympics and many, many other organizations. Bridge has mentioned City Year. There's fantastic organizations where you can still make a difference, still contribute financially, still contribute time, still contribute effort. And the creativity is just extraordinary. But let's remember, we've also got big challenges. We've got a digital divide. And even as we reach, and even as we use this technology, and so many members of the University of Virginia community can access this, and people around the country, many people will never see this on a big screen. If they're lucky, they'll see it on a small phone, and many will never see it at all. Why? Because they don't have the access. So there are common enterprise. There's common purpose here. You say who should run it. I remember hearing the stories when I was a little kid. We moved to Washington after the election of President Kennedy, and my dad was asked to start something that didn't exist and had no precedent, the Peace Corps. And he tells the story of spending night after night, week after week at hotels in Washington with a handful of people trying to answer incoming mail. But within 3 to 4 months, Peace Corps volunteers were in the field, and the federal government, combined with many, many volunteer organizations, had figured out a plan, had figured out a purpose, had figured out a training protocol, and had put people in the field. And the imagination of Americans and the goodwill of the rest of the world was put on steroids. Same thing happened with, like Job Corps. I mean, people think of these things as federal government things. They were almost all the Job Corps programs in the late 1960s were run by private sector companies in partnership with the federal government. So the idea that we would use private enterprise and public will, citizen action and public resources together, we're told a story that those are opposites. They're not opposites, and they have never been opposites. We've been lied to about this. We've been lied to about the story of, I hate big government, I love big government. Nobody loves big government. Nobody hates government. You only end up there if you've been fed a whole lot of information that makes you think I shouldn't like my high school principal. Why? Because she works for the government? I mean, how many people actually really concretely think that way? Very, very few. Teachers work in most respects for the government. Does that mean you hate them because they're teachers? Of course you don't think that way. Police officers, fire department professionals, these are all people who represent us. So if you don't like the word government, don't use it, but they're us. They work with, for, and on behalf of us. We admire them. We want them to be successful, and we want to help them. So this idea that there's this polarization that we have to hate one or love the other, I just feel like we need leaders to remind us that's not the case. It really doesn't need to be that way. we have a much richer, more healthy, more hopeful, and I dare say more loving alternative, which is to come up with solutions and ideas that unite us, and then let's go to work and make them come to life. We can do such extraordinary things as a country. Even in the face of this extraordinary challenge, where basic necessities are the frontline issue, we can still use this, if I can put it this way, use this horrible time to find the best in us for the future.
I want to circle back to leadership in a bit, but I do want to stick with something that you both mentioned, which is students. We've got a couple questions here. There are probably students watching, and there are certainly parents of students watching, myself included, trying to figure out what they're going to do with their kids this summer, what they might do if schools don't come back into session in the fall, or taking alternative and gap years. What would your advice be to students now as these various organizations are going through a transition, both to the students and the organizations? How do you make this match right now? How do we generate the connectivity to students who are in the earliest stages of their career, whose summer internships may have been suspended? We're working hard on this. Just give us a sense of how you think about the high school and college students out there.
This is very personal for me, Bill. My son is graduating from college in May, and of course, there's no graduation; it's postponed to the fall, and this last semester is virtual. And so, as he was looking for his next step on his journey, we talked about national service. So he'll be starting in City Year San Jose this summer. So he'll have a full year of national service, which not only will build skills, young people, when they go through these efforts, they discover their leaders. They learn to listen, be empathetic, work with people who are different from they are, and then serve, great public needs. It builds such extraordinary confidence in their ability to engage with the world and to address public challenges. So my advice is actually, I know, and a couple of his roommates actually had jobs that were rescinded because of the economic downturn. And now they're looking into national service. So whether you come to it as an attraction initially, or whether you come to it from the perspective of, there aren't any jobs out there and the economy is going to be rough, either way is beneficial. I would encourage you to look at the websites of City Year and Teach for America and Habitat for Humanity. Actually go to serviceyear.org. It's a system built under the leadership of General Stanley McChrystal, who served for 34 years in the U.S. Army and came back from Iraq and Afghanistan and said less than 1% are serving in our military during war, leading to the complacent assumption serving the country somebody else's job, and called for large-scale civilian national service. And we're working really hard now to get congressional legislation passed that will create even more opportunity. But I would go to serviceyear.org and look for national service opportunities that marry, with your interests. And then I'd be delighted to talk to anybody on this panel or in this Zoom convening, about their personal journey, and try to be helpful and network them or connect them to opportunities to the extent I can.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Bridge. And I think the point, I want to just underscore the point you made about becoming leaders. The thing that I notice in this generation is a disdain for the idea of service as people of means helping people who don't have things. This sense of I'm privileged and I'm going to therefore give something to someone who's not privileged. I know that's a big part of how we are all drawn into this kind of conversation, but this generation wants a different model, which is much more of a relational model. It's much more of a discovery model, if I can put it that way. It's much more of a listening model. It's much more of an interactive giving and receiving. The person may be coming to help the high school student who needs help to stay in school, also needs to learn from that high school student about what's kept her or him out of school, where the barriers are to finding meaning and purpose in his community, what the deeper obstacles are to finding fulfillment and hope in school. That relationship of learning and mutual growth is almost exuberant. It lights people up. And it's what we need now. We need a model of service that is about healing the gap, bridging the divide, crossing the chasm, coming to meet one another. So whether you come, as Bridge said, out of duress to service, or whether you come out of desire to service, come to it recognizing that this may be the chance to save not just another life, but your own, to see yourself as in a learning experience from someone who you may have thought had very little. Maybe you're in relationship to a homeless person who seems by every social indicator to have nothing. And that person may end up being the teacher you most need to find something in your life that matters most. These are different models. They're not radically new. Some of this is in biblical texts, and certainly much of it is in history and in philosophy and in religion and in spirituality. But we need to remind each other now in this moment. And so that's number one. Number two, I would just say, we need ideas that unite. You know, Bridge has worked in the West Wing of the White House. Many of us have had the opportunity to meet very influential, important decision makers. They're looking for ideas that unite us now. We need this community to generate its own agenda. What should the sustainable development goals, the great goals of the United States be for the next 5 years? Not the little incremental fights we want to win, but what are the big ideas that bring us together? And so I invite, you know, I think there are 150 people on this call. Let's find the ideas in this community that could change the state of Virginia, that could unite Virginians. Many of you, I assume, but maybe it's for the country. There's a new idea in this community right now that hasn't found its way to a state house. It hasn't found its way to a state legislature. It hasn't found its way to a mayor's office, and it hasn't found its way to Washington. Let's identify it, because, as I said, you know, the country. Look, the problem we have in this crisis is that cash, financial resources are going to, I'm sorry to say, mostly have to come initially from the federal government. We're going to have 20, 30 million people unemployed. There's nowhere to get that money except from the federal government. But the question is, what do we do with it? And what do we ask of the people who are receiving it? And what do those of us who have enough bandwidth to be helpful, we're not struggling as much as others, what can we do to create common purpose right now? Right now, what can we ask of the Speaker of the House, the leader of the Senate, the occupant of the White House, the State House, the state? What can we ask of each other right now that will bring us together? Those ideas, in addition to the commitment to serve, are necessary right now. And I'm laying out the challenge to this community, to the Miller Center community. What are the three best ideas this community can create right now that will, in service to the country, unite the country?
So I'm gonna ask you to help us do a little imagining. Sometimes the best innovations come from looking back in the past and finding moments in history where an idea comes forward. The Renaissance was, of course, just a rediscovery of what had already taken place in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And so looking back across American history, and since you've both touched on leadership as being essential, you've written about it together, what are some of the ideas that leaders have put forward in the past that inspire you and get your own head thinking about, could we do this in a different way now?
You know, I'd say that, you know, one of America's best ideas was George Catlin goes to the Dakotas. Then there's the Hayden expedition, which takes these extraordinary photographs of our landscapes across America. And it was individual citizens all across the country that actually ignited Congress to create a national park system, a great democratic idea. Instead of, you know, beautiful places being owned by czars and the wealthy, every American owns those places in perpetuity and for the enjoyment and use of future generations. Another big idea, and Tim touched upon this, you know, right in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, we've discovered 60% of students on tribal lands don't even have any access to the internet at all. In rural and other communities, as schools are struggling to engage students, they're discovering a lot of their students and families don't have, again, access to the internet. So this community, the 150 strong in this call, could organize a broadband access corps to basically do for the United States today what Morris Clark and rural electrification did in the 1930s to bring electricity all across the country, and to close the digital divide, to look at, you know, where are the places where people are underserved? how can those gaps be closed between government and the private sector and provide appropriate government investment where there aren't market incentives? And what's the role of individuals in a broadband access core in providing internet hotspots today to those places that have need? I just want to quickly say, Julie raised a great question about contact tracing. She's exactly right. It needs to run through public health, but it needs more capacity. And that's where the contact tracing core could come in. Valentina raised a great point about, isn't service kind of paternalistic? And Tim touched upon this. It's really important to engage people. The Earth Conservation Corps engages the most vulnerable youth in Washington, D.C. today, not viewing them as problems to be solved, but to potential to be unleashed. And LaShante Moore, who was a single unwed mother with 2 kids, homeless on the streets, was part of the Earth Conservation Corps that brought the nation's symbol, the bald eagle, back to the nation's capital. And now she's a leader in the conservation movement. And finally, Patrick raised this good point about compulsory national service. And I don't know if you want to get into that, Bill, but I'm happy.
I do. I definitely wanted to come to that, but go ahead, John, if you're there.
I don't, Tim probably has great thoughts about the moments in history that have excited us.
Well, I mean, I think, Bridge, you've got great ones, but I mean, I go to my own experience just because it's what I know best. When Head Start was opened in this country, the idea of early childhood education was new. The idea that children as young as 3 or 4 or 5 years old were worthy of anything, needed anything, was new. The idea that those services, the services of an early childhood education experience that included parents as teachers, was new. And here we are over 50 years later, and I'm going to sound like a Democrat, it's woefully underfunded. I mean, could it be better? Of course. Do we mean to improve it? But I mean, why we don't have a national commitment to comprehensive early child care supports with moms and dads, it's staggering in the richest country in the world. And with spending money like we're spending now, why aren't we spending? I mean, again, I'm right. So I think that's a fantastic thing. We have a major job skill gap in this country. We've seen it in every national election for the last several. Where people who are in industries that are losing ground, or the country believes should lose ground even, ultimately into the future, maybe those skills are no longer the skills needed for the future. Many people in politics have said, we need different skills in the future. Why not a national job training initiative run by business, funded by common purpose, dedicated to the skills of the future? Why not tens of thousands of people being retrained for the skills of the future? Why aren't we training a new generation of Americans to do alternate energy, to do technology, to do human services, to do rural broadband, to do healthcare? We see the crisis. Why don't we have the best healthcare system in the world in terms of all the backup and redundancies we need? I mean, there's so many simple, I don't want to call them simple, but there's so many easy in a way wins. Do they cost money? Yes. Let's be honest. To make and build a better future is going to cost money. Do we have it? It's hard to imagine that we do, with states on the verge of bankruptcy and so many Americans on the verge of bankruptcy themselves, and the federal government in such distress.
Well, let me take that, actually, because I think that's a great bridge to both Valentina's question and the question about compulsory service. One could say that this is a war. And the way that we got out of the last depression, while Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA and all these projects were having some impact, was the massive spending, deficit fueled, to fight World War II. And so if this is a war, and the next set of wars are not going to be fought by armies, but by an army of civilians called to service on health, education, and rural broadband, why isn't this run by the government, compulsory for students or for unemployed students or recent graduates or young people or other people out of work, where people have to serve for 2 or 3 years, just like there was a draft. And, my daughter might be assigned to be a hospital orderly. My other daughter might be assigned to work on rural broadband. Why doesn't this kind of national service become compulsory, funded by debt that gets paid off in a future generation after we get out of this, the way we fought World War II?
Great question. So interestingly, after 9/11, the first thing Josh Bolton and I raised was, why don't we make a mandatory 2-year commitment for young people 18 to 28? So there's some flexibility within the system, but literally run it as an option through the selective service system. Because you can serve your country in many ways: military, public or government service, or civilian national service. And in consulting with the White House counsel, we said you have to look at the 13th Amendment prohibition on involuntary servitude, the 5th Amendment prohibition on deprivation of liberty, and the First Amendment of compelling people to serve in areas that might have either interfere with their free exercise of religion or free speech. Having said that, we conducted a 2-year analysis of mandatory service in the United States, and it can be structured just like in Israel, like the Israeli Defense Force that has a civilian national counterpart, to be effectively a mandatory system. And a lot of us are very sympathetic to that. But less than 20% of the American people, and of course then the people in Congress, Charlie Rangel, the representative from New York, would introduce a lonely bill for mandatory national service every year, and it never got any support. So what Stan McChrystal and Robert Gates and Condi Rice and this group of us who are working through the Service Year Alliance, and these people representing more than 100 years of service to the country, are calling for a common opportunity and expectation, at least a year or more of national service, a rite of passage. And to close, so Patrick, that's the answer to your question. To Patricia, isn't this just Pollyannish, and what is this all going to mean? Well, it's not Pollyannish to the young people, the 5 times as many young people who are raising their hand to serve their country in Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, Vista, Conservation Corps, who want to serve the nation and are being turned away because there isn't sufficient funding. The last time the country increased national service in the United States was George W. Bush after 9/11, growing Peace Corps to historic levels. And by the way, Tim's dad, Sergeant Shriver, was my mentor after 9/11 and helped me so much, as did Tim. I got to know Tim in this period. Grew AmeriCorps to the highest levels, and it's still there, Vista, and Senior Corps for older Americans. And to the point about, well, didn't Bush just say, oh, just go shopping? He never said go shopping. He issued the call to service repeatedly. He did 32 national service events. Imagine that, to awaken the country to these opportunities and to serve. And that term, go shopping, it was Frank Pellegrini in a Time magazine cover story praising Bush for the most spine-chilling speech of his life, saying, in the aftermath of the economy shedding more than 1 million jobs, Bush said, I want you to have faith in the American economy. And Frank Pellegrini, the author, said, for God's sakes, go shopping. So Bush never said it. It became a little bit of a myth, but I wanted Patricia to know this isn't Pollyannish to kids who want to serve their country. We've got to do more, as Tim said, to fund and support these programs so young people's idealism are translated into real service opportunities that develop them as leaders across difference, exactly what this country needs. So that Republicans, Democrats, independents who eventually serve in government have learned the skills to work together to solve big challenges.
Yeah. I mean, I would go back to your point, Bill. Do we need a massive investment in the future of this country right now? Deficit funded investment to both get us out of this crisis economically and get us out of this crisis, I would say, culturally, socially, politically, whatever you want to call it. My answer would be, we have no choice. We have no choice. We're already doing that. The question isn't, are we going to have a massive federal spend to get us out of this? The question is, what are we going to do with it? Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's an either or. That's a how and why.
Right. So to the how and why, then there's a question here about local organizations that currently exist. And I do wonder, because I'm drawn to it as well, if you build national service, particularly a formalized program that is the modern day equivalent of the draft, but you're drafted into public service as they have in Israel and other places, does that undermine or compete with, or can it be done in sync with the various voluntary organizations that currently exist? So for instance, could somebody be assigned to or volunteer for Special Olympics and have that count
Yeah.
as their
I
national
mean,
service?
the answer is a big yes. That's the way it already actually works. You can be funded through AmeriCorps, as Bridge said earlier on, and then you get assigned to Special Olympics or City Year or many other organizations, and you spend your year working in that organization. You don't spend you wear the AmeriCorps badge and you boast, we hope, of your service to the country, but your service to the country is in and a placement in the Special Olympics movement. Or the same thing happens in Peace Corps. I mean, these things don't stand on their own. Peace Corps volunteers go into a community and they work with a community, in a community, for a community-based organization, not on their own for the most part.
Right.
But I guess I just want to say on this Pollyannish point, because I think this is a big point. This becomes Pollyannish when we don't take it seriously. Let's not just remember that our political figures are responsible here. We are too. And if all we consume is things that we think are edgy and tough and strong, and they're just filled with hate and anger and animosity, then we're part of the demand curve that's asking for more of that message. This message is not Pollyannish unless we let it become that. Mm-hmm. And we've got to recover the sense in which service is about social justice. Service is about personal transformation. Service is about making us a different people in a way that will require us to get out of our comfort zone, will require us to get into things that may challenge us, that get us to the point where we think we can't do it, and then we find a way. This is tough work. The slogan of the Peace Corps, remember, is the toughest job you'll ever love, not the sweetest job. I've been in Special Olympics movement more than half of my life, maybe my whole life, depending on how you count. And people sometimes say to me, "Isn't that nice?" And you can see it makes me, frustrates me. We're talking about a 6 or an 8-year-old who has Down syndrome, who's lived with stigma her whole life, who's been pointed to and made fun of and kicked out of schools and not welcome in medical institutions her whole life. And you're telling me that it's nice? I dare say this is a viscerally important, life-changing, social and cultural changing work. And the fact that we have fun doing it, well, that's wonderful. But we've got to recover that there is hard work to be done in this country that's not going to be done by yelling at each other. It's going to be done by putting ourselves on the line. And Patricia's right. Most of the time, people like us look and sound Pollyannish. Shame on us. That's on us. That's on me. We got to get back to realizing this is, in some ways, I dare say, life and death. We either make it together in this country now, or we don't make it, if you ask me. So this is serious business. And do we need the federal government? Yes, because small organizations, no matter how robust, no matter how inspiring, they can't do this alone. They can't build common alone. Mm-hmm. That's why we have leaders. That's why we have institutions that bring us together. We call them legislators, mayors, presidents, senators, congressmen, school principals, fire chiefs, police chiefs. That's what we call people responsible for our common purpose. We need them now to do this extremely critical work.
Mm-hmm. Bill, can I add to that? Just also the questions. It's interesting, this is a very famous story. Everybody seems to know it. Franklin comes out of the convention. A woman asks him, "Mr. Franklin, what have we wrought?" And he says, "A republic if you can keep it." Which was it was a big idea. We didn't have a country based on land or wealth, or it was based on an idea. And it wasn't an idea that initially when the founding, the 2 million people in the United States, indigenous peoples were excluded, Blacks were excluded, people who didn't have property were excluded. And I see a good question from Nicole Huffman about, don't we have a nation where if you're not wealthy and you don't have access to the political leaders, you're not listened to? We need campaign finance reform. We need political reform to make the system fair and transparent and easier to access for all. National service can play a big role in that. Andrew Holmes asked a wonderful question about how can national service cultivate a love of country? It was interesting, Washington and Adams and Madison and Jefferson worried so much that in founding a country so strongly predicated on rights, in the context of a revolution, that won those rights, that future generations distant from the revolution would not stand up to serve and to accept responsibility for maintaining that freedom. So they envisioned a national university that will actually teach the habits of citizenship, including service to nation. And I just want to also note Patricia Johnson, I think maybe the same person that had the comment about Pollyannish, I'm not sure, but she had a wonderful idea, which we're working on, which is why not work with high school guidance counselors who, from the perspective of, these kids are going to go off, they're going to go to college or 1-year occupational certificate or 2-year community college degree, and they're going to have debts, a lot of them. And on their path to the American dream, why not have a national service system that takes a view of that and says, you invest in your country, we'll invest in you. And to create this pipeline from high school, college, beyond that is a rite of passage for more young people to serve the nation. And the good news is we have amazing infrastructure through these programs. They just need to be scaled up. And I think they will be in this environment.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd love to start hearing as we come to a close. I've got 2 questions for each of you. The first, if we can go to lightning round. The first is, we're looking for our national leaders, and by national, I don't mean just the President of the United States, though we could start there, but also governors, business leaders, and others to lead us in this moment. When it comes to service, what is the one thing, if you were talking to any one of these leaders right now, what do you put at the top of their talking points? What do you want them to be saying to the American people about service?
I'll be really quick. Ask and all that if you look at national leaders, state leaders across history, what they're remembered for is asking the ordinary to become the extraordinary. That citizens in their lives, everybody, Bill Buckley said, everybody wants to be a knight. And, how can we awaken ourselves out of our ordinary daily lives to do something extraordinary for the country and have our scratch on history? I think we all fundamentally want to do that in some sense. And national and volunteer service enables you to do that. And having governors, mayors, presidents, members of Congress issue calls to service and then connect people to real opportunity to do that can awaken a spirit in this country that'll be like what Ronald Reagan called a deep and mighty, the spirit of volunteer service flows like a deep and mighty river through the history of our nation. And people want to connect to that.
I'd say have that be the speech and have the legislation be, I'm just going to steal this because Bridge said it the other day when we were talking on the phone, to challenge the federal government to create a 3 million person corps called the America Unites Corps and put 3 million Americans to work within 6 months on the 10 projects, the 10 most powerful ideas generated by the American people that can bring us together and build a future of equality and justice that we needed before this crisis and that we now must have in order to come out of it. Put Americans to work, create a major, mind-blowing commitment at a huge level that we must do to unite the country. And remember, Bridge tells the story better than I do. When President Kennedy gave his speech at the University of Michigan talking about, well, wouldn't we, during the campaign at 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning to a group of assembled students, how many of you would like to serve your country? How many of you would like to go out into developing countries? How many of you would give of yourself? He asked the question. And it was the students who responded with overwhelming numbers because he didn't know if the speech was any good. He didn't know if there would be any response. You're on a campaign. Those of you who've watched presidential campaigns, you give 6, 8, 10, 12 speeches a day. You start at, the factory gate and you end up at a hotel ballroom and you're giving them all the time. So he just gave a speech, but the students said, we want what you've asked us for. It's time for the American people to say, we want to serve and we should demand that our leaders right now put 3 million Americans to work on a core that unites.
So last question, 3 minutes left. It's great stuff. What is the most important thing you all are doing in the next 3 months? What is the one thing that is driving you right now? Single most important thing. It's hard. I just had a board meeting. I've got 7 things I'm supposed to be doing. What's at the top of your
I'll
list?
say 2 quick things. One is I think we're subsidizing massive unemployment in the United States through the Congress, through a 1930s system that was built for that time. It's not appropriate for the modern age. We should take a play from Europe, from the UK, France, Germany, they have low unemployment in the face of the pandemic because they're providing emergency wage support efficiently to small businesses and their workers to keep them attached and employed to their workplaces. And keeping small businesses afloat. And so we're working with Senator Mark Warner in the Congress and others on an emergency wage support or Paycheck Security Act that would actually keep small businesses, the mom and pops, restaurants, hair salons, others open and afloat from an operational standpoint, and their workers employed. So we don't have the kind of unemployment levels we had in the height of the Great Depression. Second thing that's most exciting to me, it's Tim's effort. He'll talk about it, Unite. But we have sustainable development goals for the world. We need 10 sustainable opportunity millennium goals. Oh my gods.
OMGs.
OMGs for the United States. And so Tim and I are working together. Would love to work with anybody on this panel and students across the country to inform what do you want your futures to be and what kind of goals can we point the country toward to meet together?
I'd say the most important thing I'm doing right now is trying to take care of my own family and myself. Like many other families, we've experienced loss in this period. So let's not forget that much of this crisis is a deeply emotional and spiritual crisis, that we're relying on each other in new and different ways. And let's remember that many of our brothers and sisters are in the same position, trying to make sense of extraordinary pain and extraordinary fear. We need to take care of each other. My first job is to take care, I mean, I hope it doesn't sound egotistical, of my own soul. And by doing so, I hope to be able to share faith and strength with those closest to me who are also struggling. But with that, to not miss the chance to say we need each other now more than ever. Let's not forget what it feels like when someone writes us when we've had a loss. Let's not forget what it feels like to hear that song when we see the nurse going back into the hospital. Let's not forget what it feels like to see those healthcare workers playing Amazing Grace. Let's not forget that, because right now we should take note. This is not a one-time event. This is an invitation to a different future. We will and must and do need each other, and we need each other now more than ever.
Well, Tim and John, thank you so much. We really we all need both of you. And we're super appreciative, not just for your joining us, but everything that you do.
Thank you.
Very appreciative of this audience. The number of questions for this session, I think, has at least matched, if not exceeded, any one that we've done before. That's a sign of the volunteerism that the Miller Center audience has always been. I know that for the ones that I know personally, they're among the most engaged citizens in our community. And the broader network that we've been able to get through these webinars suggests that that exists for them too. And then to our own team who puts these together, we've been doing 2 a week. We've actually done 3 this week. One that we did for our presidential cabinet yesterday with Fran Townsend, John, who talked about President Bush's effort to actually design a pandemic response effort in the wake of 9/11. We'll be broadcasting that one. That was a smaller event, but we'll be putting that up online in the coming days because we've got a terrific web team that is able to put these webinars together and post them for everyone. So thank you all and keep coming back. We appreciate your engagement and support.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.